That's part of their goal to get to 50 million creators on the platform. This Spotify Green Room is just another tool that the creators will have that they can use, and part of Spotify's strategy to just be a lot more attractive and have a lot more options for creators.
Hey gang, it's Thursday, August 5th. Peter and listeners, welcome to the Behind the Numbers Daily, an eMarketer podcast made possible by VTEX. I'm Marcus. Today I'm joined by one of our senior forecasting analysts. It's Peter Varley.
Hey, Marcus.
Hey, buddy. Thanks for joining us. Today's fact: the 5-second rule should actually be the half-a-second rule. When you drop a piece of food on the ground, you might think that if you pick it up with lightning speed, then it's still perfectly edible. I give you the 5-second rule. Unfortunately, it's nonsense. Rutgers University backed up previous data in a 2016 study by finding it takes less than half a second for bacteria to make its way onto food that's being dropped on the ground. So, if you see someone retrieve food from the ground after 4 long, very traumatizing seconds, then you smack it out of their hands and you say, "No, you're better than that." And you can also tell them that we produce 1.5 times as much food as there are people, so we'll get you another everything bagel, for crying out loud.
Everything bagel, that's a valuable thing not to pick back up. I thought if it was a peanut or a cashew, then let it go. But a full bagel.
You going after it, Peter?
Oh, definitely. It also depends if it's the sidewalk or if it's my kitchen. That definitely factors into it. But yeah, I would pick up that.
That's also to do with how many people are looking. Do I have an audience, or can I get this off the ground quickly without anyone noticing?
Yeah.
I don't understand the everything bagel. Because if someone said to you, "Oh, yeah, so we have the special, we have the everything lobster," you'd go, "It doesn't need everything, okay? Doesn't need everything on the lobster. Why is it okay to put everything on a bagel? What do they mean by everything?" That's what I've got to know.
And now what's really popular is the everything but the bagel seasoning. I feel like I see that everywhere. So it must be popular. People want everything.
New Yorkers. You're the best and also the worst. Anyway, today's real topic, Spotify's April, May and June. We're talking Spotify today, lots to cover, let's do it. We start with the user highlights. Spotify added 9 million new subscribers from Q1 to Q2 of this year. 7 million were paid, wanting the ad-free experience. The other 2 million were ad-supported folks. That brings Spotify's total to 365 million monthly active users as they march towards 400 million. Peter, your takeaway from their user highlights, Spotify in Q2, and also a letter grade on their overall performance user-wise.
In terms of users, I would give Spotify a B grade. So right there, I guess above average. Their quarter-over-quarter growth was slightly up, but year-over-year was up 22%. That made a lot of people disappointed. A lot of analysts thought that was not very impressive. It did come in slightly below their guidance. So, that was the cause for some concern. The reasons that Spotify gave for why they were a little sluggish on growth was slower growth in emerging markets. They also paused some of their marketing campaigns in areas where the pandemic was particularly bad. And they also mentioned an issue with a third-party sign-up service that actually stunted some of the growth and made it so some people couldn't sign up. But I think big picture, Daniel Ek, who's Spotify CEO, keeps reiterating that growth was pulled forward in 2020, where they actually had more people listening to Spotify, more people signing up than they anticipated. So a lot of the growth that would have happened this year was actually happening last year, earlier in 2020. Mm-hmm. So overall, I think that, listeners are growing on track. They didn't have the best quarter ever, but things are still looking good. A lot more people are signing up and listening to Spotify.
So yes, that year-on-year growth, really good, 22%. They expected 24%. As you mentioned, though, they were short of their goal. They've been expecting about 14 million in the quarter. They came in, as I mentioned, up 9 million as opposed to 14. Yeah, they said there was some uncertainty in those emerging markets, India, Brazil, Southeast Asia. They're relying on those markets for their new user growth. But COVID-19 increases, and Steele of the Wall Street Journal was pointing out, haven't helped. Also, people emerging from their homes, going outdoors more, that hasn't helped. I mean, Peter, like other companies as well that we've been talking about, it's tough to make comparisons to last year, isn't it? It's because last year was so crazy. But by and large, we've had to do it with the other companies, and I think they didn't do terribly when you look at the full year-on-year growth. But on a quarter-on-quarter basis, not so fantastic. Spotify added nearly as many premium subscribers this Q2 as last Q2. So it was the ad-supported that fell short. They grew 7 million last Q2, the ad-supported people, just 2 million this Q2. That's quarter-on-quarter numbers. Peter, Spotify had announced its own podcast subscription service in April. Any idea how that's going or will go?
It's still too early to tell right now. What we do know is that they have this thing that they're calling Spotify Open Access, which is basically their move to allow creators to publish content to their paid audience and use Spotify podcast subscriptions as part of that. So there's an integration with the paid podcast subscriptions on Spotify with third-party platforms.
Okay. Let's zoom in on the users for a second and talk podcasts. How many Spotify users are listening to podcasts at this point? There's so much talk about podcasts, we can't sometimes forget that they're a music platform as well.
Yeah, because everyone just talks about the podcast stuff. It's growing. It's more exciting. It's where a lot of investment is happening. And according to our forecast, we predict that there will be 28.2 million Spotify podcast listeners by the end of this year. So that will be a 41.3% increase over 2020. So a lot of people are listening to podcasts on Spotify with some of their exclusive deals with Joe Rogan, with Dax Shepard's Armchair Expert, and recently the acquisition of Call Her Daddy. That's now 3 major podcasts that are exclusive, and that's a major thing that's driving listeners to Spotify's podcasts in particular.
That number you mentioned, 28 million US Spotify podcast listeners. You mentioned growth of over 40% this year. You think we forecast that this number is going to overtake Apple podcast listeners by the end of this year, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. It will just slightly eclipse Apple, which had been the dominant and sort of de facto place for podcast listening for a long time, really, ever since podcasts were a thing. So that's a major news line.
And what's going on there? Is there something that Spotify is doing particularly well? Is it something that Apple's not doing as well? What's the story behind that?
Really, the story is that Spotify has been doubling down on their podcast strategy. And like I mentioned, they have a lot of exclusive shows that are major shows that a lot of people listen to. And before, people would listen to the show like Joe Rogan on Apple or on YouTube or elsewhere. And now they have to go to Spotify for that. Also, Spotify is just growing its premium subscribers and its monthly active listeners quarter over quarter, year over year. And since the podcasts are part of the same app as the music is, then a lot of people are just finding out that there's a lot of podcasts on there. It's an easy place to listen to. On the other side, Apple really has not made the same push that Spotify has. They've had a much more hands-off, lackadaisical approach, and they've been losing share of the listener market as a result.
Yeah, Spotify adding 300,000 podcast shows to its service from Q1 to Q2. Now at 2.9 million podcasts available on the platform. Over the last 3 months, that would be over 3,000 new shows a day. So there's a lot going on. If you zoom back out for a second and we look at total Spotify, including the music people and the podcast people, John Porter of The Verge notes that Apple Music and Amazon Music, they don't regularly release comparable numbers, but their most recent figures by Music Ally put them at 60 million for Apple Music, 55 million for Amazon Music. So Spotify reporting 91 million, roughly over 90 million US users, monthly active users, for the total, as I mentioned, 365 in Q2. Peter, any update on Green Room, Spotify's social audio Clubhouse competitor, Twitter Spaces competitor?
So in their most recent earnings, they didn't really say much about Green Room. They acquired Locker Room from Betty Labs last quarter, and they've sort of revamped that app to become what is now Green Room. And that is a standalone app that Spotify's opened up and launched. It's still sort of in early stages. They said that they plan to do sort of a full commercial launch later in the year. But my perspective is that Green Room is really a long-term play for them. And it's a way that they'll enable their creators to connect with their audience in a, sort of unobstructed live way. And, that's part of their goal to get to 50 million creators on the platform. This Spotify Green Room is just another tool that the creators will have that they can use, and part of Spotify's strategy to just be a lot more attractive and have a lot more options for creators.
And I was talking about options for creators. I can't remember if Green Room was the platform that announced this, but I think I remember reading that one of these services, one of these social audio services, is going to allow you to record the rooms and flip them into podcasts.
Yeah, they'll enable that.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. And one of the only ones that said that they will so far, correct?
Yeah, to my knowledge, I haven't seen any recent updates that says the others are, but they've said that it will be easy for the creators to, quickly turn these into podcasts.
Right, which again rolls up into its podcast strategy. Another feature that caught my eye was Spotify's new What's New section in the app. It's going to collect new music and content from musicians and podcasts that you follow. That have a feed. The feed rolling out worldwide over the coming weeks on iOS and Android will be accessible via a new bell icon in the top right of your home screen. So you guys might start to notice that if you're Spotify users. A blue dot indicates that there's new content in the feed. And artists and podcasts can be added if you tap the follow button. In terms of revenue highlights, Peter, let's jump to those. Revenue-wise, Spotify beat expectations. They were hoping for 19% growth year on year. They got 23%, which is 2.3 billion euros as they report their figures, or $2.7 billion. Premium revenue grew 17%. Ad-supported more than doubled, growing 110%. So premium revenue grew 17%. Ad-supported grew 110%. I'll take a letter grade from you and then a Y.
Yeah, I'd give an A in terms of revenue. Q2 was a weak comparative. We know that advertisers pulled back. Audio was one of the areas where advertisers pulled back pretty significantly. I believe Spotify was down 21% in Q2 last year. So, a weak comparative, but still, anytime you're up 110%, that's very promising.
Things aren't bad.
And the why is, podcast revenue is still a smaller amount, but that was up 627% year over year. And they also noted that their ad studio and their direct revenue were up really, really strongly as well. The only other thing I'd add is that Daniel Ek mentioned how the days of our ad business accounting for less than 10% of our total revenue are behind us. So, the advertising revenue as a share of Spotify's revenue is really expected to grow and keep moving above that 10% threshold.
Yeah, that jumped out to me as well. Yeah, ad-supported revenue, it's actually gone from accounting for 7% of revenues of the total last Q2 to 12% of the total this Q2. So from 7 to 12 in terms of ad-supported revenue share of the total. So over the last year, it's gained 5 points of the total. And I mean, they'd grown ad-supported revenue 46% in Q1 of this year. You'd pointed out in a recent article, Peter, that you wrote that ad-supported revenues returned to positive year-on-year growth happened in Q3, continued to accelerate into Q4, did very well in Q1 and then of this year, and then continued success in Q2 as well. So it's been accelerating for a while now. Yeah, Miss Steele of the Wall Street Journal, she had pointed to contributing success from its own properties. You mentioned the success of podcasts, Ringer Podcast, Spotify Studios, and Gimlet. Also their podcast ad firm Megaphone as well, and also noting that their rollout of its Spotify Audience Network, which lets advertisers buy against audiences versus specific shows, helped it triple the podcast inventory to that it can monetize. The average revenue per user, interesting to note, increased in Q2, which is a change from their previous fortunes. The figure now sits at about $5 a month for premium subscribers, which is up from last quarter. The increase comes as Spotify increased subscription prices in the UK and the US in Q2. Average revenue per user was still down 3% year on year, however. Any mention of how the price increases affected the company?
Yeah, good sign is that they said the price increases did not have a negative impact, and actually churn was down last quarter. Okay.
Q3 and Q4. Company's guidance pointed to Q3 year-on-year revenue growth of 28%, total user growth of 27%. So high 20s for both the revenue and users for the company's guidance. Peter, do we expect Spotify to have a good Q3 and a 4?
I think so. I also think that it will be more indicative of really how Spotify is doing. Once we see those Q3 and Q4 numbers, comparing them to last year will be, will be more telling than comparing to Q2 of last year, because like you mentioned before, they had better revenue performance in the latter half of last year as sort of people settled down into their new normals and advertisers started to come back a little bit. But yeah, they launched in a lot of new markets sort of in the first half of this year. And, they had some problems with getting people to sign up, but assuming they figure those out and some of these markets mature a little bit and Spotify does some more marketing, they restart that spend. Mm-hmm. It seems like all signs point to the fact that they'll continue to grow both listeners and revenue.
That wraps up the first half of the show. It's time now for the halftime report. So Peter, give us your takeaways from the first half.
So 2 takeaways. The first one is that, advertising being up 110%, that's really huge. It's an acceleration over Q1. And we're going to, look and see how it does in Q3 and Q4 and whether or not it can maintain really strong growth over last year and the second half of this year. And number 2, just wanted to call out that with podcasts, we talk a lot about what's happening in the US, but also internationally, Spotify is making a really, really strong push. And they announced that they have over 100 new original and exclusive shows internationally. So it's not just a US focused strategy, it's also internationally. And again, that will contribute to their ad revenue at the bottom line.
We also have some worldwide podcast numbers that you're currently working on will be out sometime this month, correct?
Yeah, we're breaking out podcast listeners in 16 new markets, and those numbers should be live on the site in the next couple of weeks.
Fantastic. All right, that's all we've got time for the lead story. Time now for In Other News, but first a quick word from our sponsor, VTEX. Retail's next competitive threat may come from a business model or channel that didn't even exist a few months ago. This modern dynamic requires companies to adapt quickly, pivoting business seemingly overnight, something traditional commerce platforms just can't support. There's a new enterprise commerce platform on the rise, one that's fast and flexible and doesn't require 9 months and $1 million to get up and running. Go to vtexvtex.com/emarketer to learn more. Folks, we are back today in other news. Where does Amazon want to take ALEXA? I'm not going to. We had someone write in and they were like, "Stop saying it," because my device keeps buying stuff I don't want. So that thing. The social audio monetization problem, and the NBA and iHeartMedia are going to co-produce some podcasts. Story 1. Where does Amazon want to take, let's call her Alexi? Ina Fried of Axios writes that the company likely want to eventually get Alexi to be more like Star Trek's talking computer. This ambient computer technology is seen as the next big wave in computing, where information is personal and delivered based on whichever device is closest. Current smart speaker devices are largely reactive, waiting for a command, but recently, writes Miss Fried of Axios, Google, Amazon, and Apple have been using cues like location, history, and time of day to predict what you might want. Peter, we have some numbers on this. How many Americans currently use a smart speaker, and what does the future look like for these things?
Yeah, we forecast that there will be 92.4 million US smart speaker users this year, and that will get up to over 100, almost 103 million by 2025. So smart speaker penetration is pretty high. It's about 1/3 of internet users this year and going to keep growing.
Story 2. Back at the start of June, Ashley Carman of The Verge wrote a piece about a new collection trying to solve the live or social audio monetization problem, i.e. how Clubhouse-like platforms can make money. She notes that a group of mainly tech-focused hosts are launching a shared podcast feed that rounds up many social audio chats they've started, with plans to run ads across them. Ms. Carmen explains that the group of about 9 or so folks will share a podcast feed where they can publish audio they've recorded live across various social audio platforms like Clubhouse, Twitter Spaces, and that feed, which is already live but hasn't been publicly announced, is called Spacecasts. Money is split based on downloads. So if one member contributes only one show a month but accounts for 20% of the downloads, then they get a 20% cut of the revenue. Peter, your thoughts on monetizing social audio?
I think it comes down to whether or not they're recording something and publishing something that would perform well as a podcast, because if it doesn't perform well as a podcast, then nobody's going to really make much money from it. And even if, a lot of people are calling in on the live audio, if that's not translating to revenue, then there won't be too long of a life for this sort of content. And while I don't think it's revolutionary, I do think it's something that when done right with this sort of crowdsourcing of guests, I think it could be something that does well eventually.
Yeah. The shared feed is interesting. And also, the plan to run ads across them is also interesting as well. But to your point, yes, social audio content, very different from podcast content. Doesn't always translate. Story 3. The NBA and iHeartMedia will launch over 20 new co-produced podcasts as part of a multi-year partnership, reports Jay Peters of The Verge. The first show will debut this fall. A press release explains the new shows will be produced using a wide variety of content from the NBA archives to tell the backstories of some of the greatest moments in sports history, along with a mix of the latest league news, player commentary, insider analysis, and much more. Peter, what do you make of this deal?
Yeah, it's one of many that we've seen recently. The NFL signed a deal with iHeartMedia. The MLB recently signed a podcast deal with Odyssey, the big radio company. And there seems to be a big appetite for sports documentaries and sports storytelling. Recently, The Last Dance, which was the Michael Jordan Chicago Bulls documentary on Netflix, did really well. And then the Formula One series on Netflix has also done really well, where they, tell a story per season. And I think it's exciting. The NBA said we have tons of audio footage that's never seen the light of day. And being able to use that to tell compelling stories in podcast format seems like a win-win for everyone involved.
Yeah, a lot of content just sat around that they could definitely repurpose. As you mentioned, that ESPN and Netflix teaming up with Spotify last year on Podcast for the Last Dance. And the article was noting not just traditional sports that are getting involved with podcasts. Spotify and Riot Games, developer of popular title League of Legends, set a multi-year partnership in August. That's all we've got time for. Thank you so much to my guests. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Marcus.
Thank you to Victoria, who edits the show. Thank you to everyone listening. We'll hopefully see you tomorrow for the Behind the Numbers Weekly Listen, a new marketer podcast made possible by VTEX.